On this day, May 6, 1976, Elizabeth Golterman is being interviewed by Calvin Owens as part of the ECT Foundation Oral History Project. The interview is being conducted at radio station KSLH in St. Louis, Missouri. Elizabeth, we're perhaps new at this sort of thing, and we'll try to struggle through this interview and remain relatively unscathed. But we would like to get an overview of particularly your impact and interest in the audiovisual field and education in a broader sense. I'm certain that you've always considered yourself a teacher first and an audiovisual or media person second. Isn't that generally the way you view yourself?
Oh, yes. This is very true, Cal. And I think that the department which I have been privileged to be with, this has been true staff-wise. I began as a young teacher. I began teaching, in fact, before I had my degree. I was 17 years old and taught social studies in departmental upper grades and then became a primary teacher and was fortunate to be a teacher who was invited to become a teacher member of the staff at what was then called the Educational Museum. It was headed up by Amelia Meissner, who had been a fine teacher and had two other older teachers on the staff, and Miss Meissner had been allowed to enlarge the staff by adding one teacher with a few years' experience, but not many, and I was that teacher.
Elizabeth, your background then was in social studies. Where did you go to school?
I went to Harris Teachers College. I spent a year at the University of Illinois, came back, and after I was working at the Educational Museum, completed my degree work at Harris Teachers College. Then in 1937, I took a year off, went to Teachers College, Columbia University, and got my master's then. During that time, did some work with an early EFLA evaluation project while I was at the university, and got my degree from Columbia, so that I really went to that with the background of several years' experience of working at an active audiovisual center.
Mm-hmm. Elizabeth, are you a native St. Louisan?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was born. My friends laugh at me when I use every opportunity to mention that I lived in a home in Carondelet down in the southern part of St. Louis that 5 generations of our family had lived in. But this was my home. And I found that really in working in audiovisual education, I was working with so many things that had been part of my interests on the beforehand, because I've always been interested in the out of doors. I've learned as I could many things about it, and certainly found out that working at the Educational Museum fit in to be perhaps the best education that I had had. I'd like to say one thing right here, Cal. Many people, now that I am retired, think of me as an audiovisual pioneer. But actually, in 1930, when I became a member of the staff of the St. Louis School Audiovisual Center, I was joining the staff of an institution that had been begun back in 1904 and had been reaching the classrooms through weekly deliveries since 1905, so that it had had 25 years of experience when I became part of it.
Yeah, the city of St. Louis has always had a very, very distinguished history of educational innovation. What, in your opinion, permitted the development of that spirit of exploration, of inquiry, and of innovation?
Well, Cal, I think that it was the climate that was set certainly under the leadership of a man like William Torrey Harris, who was the superintendent back in the latter part of the 1800s, a man who was an educator, who was a philosopher. He left St. Louis to become the Commissioner of Education. It was during Harris's time that he recognized the worth of the ideas of Susan Blow, who had been so impressed with the kindergarten movement in Germany. And he backed and allowed Susan Blow's founding what was the first permanent public school kindergarten in the United States. There had been earlier kindergartens, never public school ones. There was one in Wisconsin, another in the East that Elizabeth Peabody had. And I think that the spirit of inquiry, the wishing to try things, was certainly reflected in his successor, who was F. Lewis Soldan. Dr. Soldan wrote a credo for special education at the time that the St. Louis schools began various forms of special education that many leaders have said was just as applicable in 1970 as it had been in the early 1900s. Manual training began back in those early years. There were other things that were nationally unknown until they were started in St. Louis, and I think that it was this educational climate that made things ready to start the audiovisual services. You know what they grew out of, Cal?
I have a general idea. It seems that I recall reading the audiovisual department had its origin as a result of the Louisiana Purchase Exposition that was held in 1904.
This is right, and there were classes from the schools daily that were out there. I think they were not only there to visit, but I think that they were there to give certain kinds of demonstrations. And the superintendent and Carl Rothman, who was an assistant superintendent, were so impressed with how much those boys and girls were learning by seeing things that up until then they had simply read about. And they talked this over, they talked it over with the board members, and back, still in 1904, appropriated $1,000 to try to buy some of the exhibits from the fair to be kept in St. Louis. Mr. Rothman, they used to tell us, just went from exhibitor to exhibitor, and these were exhibitions of various countries, perhaps more than anything else. And as a result of this, he begged, he bought, and there was a vast amount of material that was left behind after the World's Fair ended. It was all stored in the corridors and one big room at Wyman's School, which is just next door to the building where we are now. And the woman who was put in charge of it had been an upper grade teacher down at Madison School who had been released from her teaching to help with various exhibit things out at the World's Fair, Amelia Meissner, and she was really the audiovisual pioneer, I think, of this country, because she began, I wish that I could show you, but we are going to spare one for you to send to the DAVI archives, the first printed catalog that was a 1905 catalog, and the visuals that were there were object collections, were sets of lantern slides, and sets of stereoscopic views. Every school received a box of scopes to keep from September until June, and then they were loaned the views on one-week loans. But we really grew out of the World's Fair.
You also mentioned, getting back to this climate question, Elizabeth, in our preliminary discussions, that as a matter of fact, the superintendent of schools of the city of St. Louis had as one of his hobbies the hobby of photography. And it was kind of an interesting little anecdote that might be fun to
Yes.
recall.
Dr. Soldan apparently was a fine photographer and had traveled widely and had had many of his slides made into old glass 3 1/4 by 4-inch lantern slides, which were organized in sets and kept down in the superintendent's office, so that teachers who wanted to borrow slides, this was back in 1901, could stop by the Board of Education headquarters, borrow slides, and use them and see that they got back. Also, in reading some of the old history materials, I realized that it was photography that had really brought Amelia Meissner into this picture. She had, as a young teacher, had been on the way to a convention in Washington and found that she was assigned a Pullman seat beside the superintendent of schools, whom she had never met, Dr. Soldan. And they talked about photography. She had her camera with her and shared many interests. He remembered this, and the next summer or the summer after, she was in Germany with her family and was at Oberammergau and met her superintendent, who remembered her name, and they discussed some of the pictures they were taking. And when the time came that the World's Fair was ahead and the St. Louis schools were to have photographic exhibits of children in classrooms, one of the 3 people who was invited to do the photographic work for the World's Fair exhibit was this young teacher that Dr. Soldan had remembered talking photography with. So this was where Miss Meissner came into her later work with the Educational Museum.
So I suppose that when one attends an AECT conference and sees a young person with a camera over his or her shoulder, that might be the beginning of something far into the future.
How right you are.
Elizabeth, the city of St. Louis, of course, has had a very long and distinguished history in educational innovation broadly and specifically in audiovisual, and it's almost a tremendous coincidence that the county of St. Louis County also was one of the first educational cooperatives in the country and had its origin in 1928. Who were involved in those early days in audiovisual work throughout not only the city of St. Louis, but St. Louis County as well?
Well, let's start with the county. I think that I had begun my association with the Educational Museum in 1930, and it was not long after that. In fact, you mentioned the date. I think, did you say 32? That Alma Rogers was brought to head up the county co-op, which had been in the planning for several years. You said just now, I think it began in 28. Virgil McClure, who was the superintendent at Ferguson Florissant, Ward Barnes from Normandy, John Bracken from Clayton, and I am almost sure the Webster Grove superintendent, whom I don't know whether it was still Goslin or whether Willard Goslin had left. But these people, I think, had been planning toward cooperative services for some time. I wish that I knew the background from which Alma Rogers came. I know that she was a woman who had lived in the Orient and who had a wide cultural background. I am almost sure that she had had experience with the Indianapolis Children's Museum, whether it was as a staff member or as a user, I am not sure. But she was a woman of broad viewpoint and also a very good organizer, and I think established a service that was a sound one and was highly respected by people throughout the country. So that really it was the earliest co-op, I think, in the nation, isn't this right? So that really, as neighbors, the pioneer audiovisual service in a city system and the pioneer audiovisual co-op that your county system had were in the same geographically, the same place.
And both you and I know as native St. Louisans that St. Louis is somewhat of a conservative community, and yet in spite of that, recognize the logic of mediated instruction, lending both visual and auditory enrichment to the learning experience to enhance, of course, the printed word and the book and workbook and other kinds of materials. Certainly, as a young woman in education, and I hope my male chauvinism doesn't show too much by asking the question, how did you relate to the early administrators who were probably in the mainstream at the upper level male, and how do you anticipate the feminist movement for the future?
Well, I think, Cal, I certainly didn't feel we were part of any feminist movement back in the 30s when I began here. It is true that our staff had begun as a staff that was headed by a woman and staffed by women, and it continued this. I think largely because we always had sought outstanding teachers of certain kinds, and the St. Louis school system, the teachers in the St. Louis school system at that period were women teachers, except in the high schools. We had many temporary teachers assigned here for just a year, where we had many men on our staffs from year to year. But I'm not sure, but what my answer is that we tried to know our job. We cared a great deal for the teachers and for the boys and girls. And I think that was the important thing, whether we were men or whether we were women. May I say, I am grateful and think that it is long overdue to be recognizing some of the blocks that traditionally women have had in many fields. But fortunately, in St. Louis, I think that we had recognition and we had good support as a department that was staffed by women, and there were some fine ones. I think that it was a privilege to have worked with Amelia Meissner. Then the next generation of our associates that included teachers like Nell Lee Jenkinson, Dorothy Blackwell, Marguerite Fleming, Gertrude Hofston, Harriet Bick. These were people that were tops, and I think the department grew with them and through them.
What are some names that you can recall from your experience, women nationally that have made contributions to education, specifically media?
Well, Cal, when you told me that the most recent ACT convention had had over 9,000 people, I thought back to the days when the NEA audiovisual department was really held together by just a few loyal people, and when the first meeting I ever attended in St. Louis at the time of an NEA superintendent's meeting, midwinter meeting, they met in our building, and I don't believe that there could have been more than 40 or 50 people there. in those early years that I remember it, I think that it was held together by Leila Trollinger from the University of Colorado, by Camilla Best, who was the New Orleans audiovisual head, by people like the elder Charles Hoban from the state of Pennsylvania, supported by a young Ohio State University man, Edgar Dale, because he began being a firm part of that when he was still quite a young man. But let me run through some of the other names, and I'm not sure. Did you ask me names or women's names?
Feel free, either gender.
Let me run down through some of the women that I have had memories and associations with certainly Ms. Trollinger and Miss Best. Wanda Daniels up in Grosse Pointe, I think, was one of the fine ones. Margaret DeVizia in Los Angeles, Helen Ratchford in Los Angeles County, who was killed in that tragic plane crash on her way to an audiovisual convention up in Minneapolis. Carolyn Gus at the University of Indiana. At NEA, Ann Heyer and Mickey Bloodworth. Emily Jones at EFLA. Rita Hochheimer was one of the really old-timers. She headed up the services in New York when first I came into this picture. Etta Schneider. And then the people here in our own area, Alma Rogers certainly, and the members of our staff I think I've mentioned. But I think back to so many of the people who've been such standbys through the years. And I think of Dean McCluskey from Scarsdale, Roger Albright from TFC, the succession of earlier Britannica men. And that led me to think of a thing that I know we talked about before, and this is how much the commercial people have offered educational leadership and support to us. I think of what through the years was probably accomplished with the scholarships that Encyclopedia Britannica gave for summer study, and how much I personally learned through being on the committee for a number of years that helped select these scholars. I think of what teaching film custodians with both Roger Albright and Stan McIntosh did for all of us in the field in working to help put on the Okoboji conferences up in Iowa. And certainly Bruce Mahan, Lee Cochran, John Hedges from the university who worked with TFC on these gave the selected audiovisual people real opportunities to know one another's viewpoints and perhaps stretch their own.
We just don't want to interrupt there, but we certainly, in talking about commercial people and yet people who have made a profound contribution to the film field and the audiovisual field, certainly Julian Bryan's name has to be recalled.
Oh, my, yes. What he has meant through his enthusiasm, his knowledge, his generosity. I suppose that there was never a time that he was coming to speak at Kiel Auditorium here in St. Louis that he didn't plan weeks ahead of time with us so that we had his daytime use for free with teachers and with classes. I think of what Maurice Mitchell, at the time that he headed both Britannica Films and the whole Encyclopedia Britannica operation, what he used to mean in his brilliant presentations that he would make for meetings, sometimes very small meetings, but very significant meetings. I think of what men who simply came and sat across the table, men like Hank Neuenhaus, who are informed, perceptive, dependable scholars who know films, I think Hank has meant so much to us. People like Ralph Wagner have. There have been, so many others. I hesitate to start. I think of Godfrey Elliott. Did you ever know Godfrey?
No, I didn't.
Well, he, in the years when he headed Young America, he brought real perception into the contacts and made you think more because he had been here.
Very closely entwined with people, of course, Elizabeth, are programs, various kinds of plans and strategies and organizations and attempts to provide enriching learning experiences for boys and girls and adults, for that matter. What were some of the early programs that you can recall that you dealt with here in St. Louis or nationally?
Cal, help me a little bit more on that. I'm not thinking with you. Programs.
I'm thinking, for example, some of the not so terribly old government supported activities, such as the NDEA or ESEA programs that you were involved with several years ago, and things that preceded that, perhaps.
Mm-hmm. Well, certainly. I think one of the high spots of my own professional experience was working from the beginning on the first NEA National Advisory Committee on Title VII, where there were 12 of us, and I was privileged to be the one who was the city audiovisual person. It was a committee that included people like Glenn Seaborg, who at that time was at Berkeley as chancellor but became head of the Atomic Energy Commission, and Ralph McGill from the Atlanta Constitution. And I think that St. Louis profited very much from the screening that, as a committee, we had to do of applications, some of which were not funded, but which had basically fine ideas that we were able to adapt and in some cases use without government funding. I guess that no one thing gave the impetus that I have seen that to match what NDEA did back in the early years. And all of us who knew what Maurice Mitchell did with his famous series of film clips that he showed at congressional hearings to give the national legislators a realization of what a good teaching film was, so that when they wrote Title III, they wrote the things into it that they did. This was probably the first thing that gave all of us, your department, ours, departments through the country, the money to try to provide the things that the schools had been using and needing all along, but in very meager supply. I think before that there was real understanding on the part of administrators of the essential importance of good teaching films that grew out of World War II. Many people that became national leaders in DAVI were part of the armed services during the war, and I think that after that, I can remember that at the American Association of School Administrators meeting in Atlantic City, I remember what happened in St. Louis after our superintendent had seen a big auditorium demonstration that Walt Wittick from the University of Wisconsin had given with a class of children. Because when the administrators had taken time for a general session to be based on audiovisual thinking, I think that it helped many other places, as it certainly did St. Louis, to be funded on a bit different basis than we had, because I began in this department in 1930, and for years we operated, except for salaries, on a $5,000 budget for a city the size of the St. Louis schools.
So budgetary constraints and limited funds isn't particularly a new thing.
It certainly is not, and I can still think back to the time that, as a fairly new director of the audiovisual services, which by that time had been renamed, so we were no longer called the Educational Museum, but we could choose between going on and patting ourselves on the back and saying we were the oldest AV service in the country, or we could be honest and say we're doing a very poor job. And here is why, and here is what. And we did this, and because we had always somehow been blessed with close relationships with St. Louis teachers, we were able to get a fine committee of teachers and principals together to really help analyze what was going on and to make recommendations. And we had a superintendent who had been influenced, I think, by the Atlantic City meeting, and we had another time a climate that the experiences of the war had given some help, and in a year's time our budget changed so much that we knew that we had to be mighty careful to handle things.
Was that
well.
Dr. Hickey?
This is right, Philip Hickey.
Right. Right. Yes, Dr. Hickey, of course, was superintendent in St. Louis for a rather long time.
I wish that I could give you the years, but he gave great years of his life. He was a fine principal of a downtown slum school, an excellent principal who went into administration first as secretary-treasurer, then as superintendent. And Dr. Hickey and Dr. William Kottmeyer, who succeeded him, both were men who gave great support and understanding of the importance of audiovisual as a part of the school system.
We just casually mentioned some organizations as we've been talking, Elizabeth, such as DAVI, now of course AECT, and EFLA. What kinds of involvement did you have with some of those organizations in their early times?
DAVI, not in the very early times, because I remember it just simply as a struggling organization. But I probably became a member of the executive committee. I would think perhaps around the early 50s. And worked with people like Floyd Brooker, Ole Larson, Walt Wittick, Charlie Hoban, Edgar Dale. It is true that most of the times that I worked with these committees, I was the only woman. Margaret DeVizia from Los Angeles came into the picture, and I got to know her, I think, through those and to appreciate what she meant. I remember in the early days of EFLA how much Irv Borland meant. And not at first, but later, what he did, because he was the man who I think had the major role in getting the postal rates established, by which we can send films and tapes at such a different rate than the regular parcel post rate. I think my memory may need some jogging here.
Certainly,
there are many others.
Certainly, Emily and Carolyn Gush, you mentioned from IU.
Yes, and I think that Emily Jones had meant so much here again was a person who had almost a Judith Christ kind of a sharp analytical mind in analyzing films, who knew films so well, who knew people, and I think was a great influence through the years.
Yes, it's been interesting to see how EFLA and AECT has grown. And of course, we are, I think, very much as outlined by some of our real pioneers. We're in the people business. I think I can't recall right offhand who made that comment. Certainly, we depend so heavily upon people, and because we're in the business to serve people, I think that's one of the real joys of our profession, is being able to meet people locally and across your state and region and nation and even around the world. What are some of, can you recall some of the more interesting people? And of course, all of the people that have been mentioned already are obviously interesting, and we could spend hours on discussing any one of them. But what are some anecdotes, perhaps, that you can recall about some people that you've met through the years?
If the dead air is here, I'm just trying to think of where to start. Well, I think back to a small meeting, one of my early meetings, up at the University of Chicago at what I think was called the Midwest Forum. It was a midsummer meeting. I can remember Miss Meissner encouraging us to go up there with her. And this was one where John Flory, Bea Harding before she had become Mrs. John Flory, Julian Bryan, and the people that I think of as the standbys, the Ole Larsons, Walt Wittix, Harold Wigren, Edgar Dales, Charles Hobans, were all there. And these meetings, there were so few of us that were really in active audiovisual work that when you went to groups like this, there wouldn't have been more than 100, because as we broke into sections, these were 25 and 30 people sections. And oh, you asked for anecdotes, and I'm talking about meetings. Cal?
Charles Hoban, you mentioned to me a little bit earlier, had a story or an episode. I don't recall whether that would be appropriate for us.
Well, this is Charles Hoban Sr., who was a stately, dignified, silver-haired man, and this was a midwinter NEA administrators meeting that was in St. Louis, and the audiovisual section met at our building, which was at 3325 Bell Avenue, just at the edge of what really had become seedy homes. And when he arrived at the meeting, I think that the thing that amused him had nothing to do with his profession, but the fact that he realized that he was passing through part of St. Louis's red light district and had been having windows tapped, that he passed up in order to come to the audiovisual meeting and laughed a good deal about it. Is that the one you meant?
Right, right.
Oh, I just sort of, I wish that I had thought more about this, because I know that through the years it would be like Goodbye, Mr. Chips, and the way that Mr. Chips would recite alphabetically the names of his former students that just strung in his memory. I think of Charles Hoban at the first audiovisual conference talking on the theme of No Man is an Island, the John Donne. I think of the sincerity and the hard work of Ole Larson. I think of Julian Bryan, who, in contrast to many commercial people who would try to do things for customers or potential customers, how he would lean over backwards so that if you were going to be in New York and needed tickets for something, you would get the tickets with a memo of, what their cost was. Just respected this kind of thing. Cal, I'm doing this very poorly, and I think I won't waste tape time. Maybe I can think about this a little bit more and tack it on to the end.
That's fine, Elizabeth. Certainly we've talked about meetings and conferences somewhat. How would you contrast some of the very early meetings and the impressions and the attitudes that were created in your mind compared to perhaps the most recent one that you've attended? There's obvious changes in faces and perhaps some differences in rather surface things, but how do you view basic changes in conferences?
Well, I think that the greatest change is what happens with size. When you are meeting with 9,200 plus people or meeting with 50 or 60 people, I think that you have to sort out from the confusion and the multiplicity of activities what you need, what you want most. Cal, I think that I was with this field from the time where we had a close bond with one another because we were needy. We somehow had ideas much more than we had budget. We lived with some of the years where unexpectedly we had money to spend and didn't always spend it as wisely as we wished had been done. I think we lived into the time when a convention now brings people from many, many different fields, not only the ones that you represent, but the administrators, on various levels, the philosophers, the sociologists, the people from many different disciplines. I think we have a harder time synthesizing what we are trying to do. But you and I are associated with a field that is one of the great futures of this country. And I think that the fact that so many people are working with it is making us realize this. I wish that I were enough of a prophet to know what is ahead, which I can only guess. But I think that out of some of the push, out of some of the confusion, is going to come more and more realization that the field with which we have worked is one that we will find is more and more going to be the basis of much of the education of the future.
Elizabeth, we've certainly alluded to books and to literature and poetry and so forth a bit. Of course, the question of the relative role of mediated forms of instruction and its relationship to the printed word still isn't quite clear. But I think we have to avoid the danger of over-mediating the instructional process and not relying upon the book and upon what the book holds for us.
Cal, of course, I think that the book is one of the media. I think that more and more the association between the trained librarian who knows books primarily as his or her field and the trained AV media person who knows this form of media primarily as his or her field, I think that we have to have closer and closer association. Sometimes this comes administratively. Sometimes this comes just because people see the need to be non-competitive, but to be cooperative about what they're doing. I think that there have been some real difficulties where there has been so much striving to administratively control books through the AV media or AV media through the trained librarian that we have seen results that have not always been desirable. I think that there have been great efforts, and I'm particularly aware of the leadership of the University of Indiana, of Syracuse, and I'm sure there has been much more to see to it that the training was a broad training and a training that would really know things, because we need them in relation to one another. I think back to, one of these reports that I looked through was a 1906 report that Charles Rothman, who was the assistant superintendent in St. Louis at that time and who had had so much to do with the founding of the Educational Museum. And in his report, he was writing about how much we need to think upon what we see, and that the meaning of one word is not found in another, but is found in rich experiences. And I think that back in 1906 that Mr. Rothman perhaps was spelling out things that we need to remember in 1976 too, because we read and we experience, and we experience through many different channels.
Elizabeth, undoubtedly, beyond the obvious changes, let's say, in motion pictures, from essentially silent films to sound films, and certainly now color films. But in your opinion, has the role of the educational film, and even more generally educational media such as film strips and slides and tapes and other things, has that role essentially changed in 20 or 30 or 40 years?
Well, I know that it has. I'm thinking back a long way. I'm really thinking back to my time as a pupil, because it was back in 1916 that in St. Louis the public schools began to use films, and those were 35 millimeter inflammable stock films that tended to be travelogue type of film. Then in when did we begin to have 16 millimeter silent film? 1928. And those 16 millimeter silent films these were films that I used as a teacher and that I worked on cataloging and selection of when I began working in the audiovisual services. And I would think that these were factual films keyed to a textbook much more than anything else. I think that as both silent and sound films have developed, because I think that there has a certain use of silent film has come back, perhaps pointed out through Julian Bryan as much as any other one way. But I think that it isn't only what color and what sound have done, but the quality of the way in which a film makes you think and the way in which a film makes you feel. I think that the literature of films is something that even you, as a much younger person, have realized the many kinds of the broad base that films have come. Cal, I'd like to turn that and ask you. Let's put you on this tape answering instead of asking. How are some of the ways that you think that within the time you have been out at County Audiovisual, you have seen films change?
Yeah, I think that they certainly have changed dramatically, Elizabeth, in even my short career in the audiovisual field. And I suspect that almost in total the change has been for the better. I think that the classroom teacher now views the film not as a replacement to core instruction, but as a supplement, as views the film as a means to achieve certain objectives that would be impossible to achieve in any other way. I think certainly that films, that teachers are more selective in their choice of films and are using them in unique ways. For example, I know of a teacher that seldom, if ever, shows a film in its entirety. The idea that a film is 10 minutes long, that one must show a film, show the full 10 minutes, is something that is being questioned by our more innovative teachers. The question of showing a film without the soundtrack being played is certainly something that is being done. And I think that the basic attitude of filmmakers has in fact have in fact changed. They've begun to think about film in a more unique way. Certainly more extensive use of color, and yet in looking at some of the early film classics, we know that black and white films were amazingly beautiful and thoroughly sound teaching tools. So perhaps we might want to be more discriminate about using color exclusively at the expense of choosing only color films rather than some black and white ones. I think we need to seriously think about making shorter films. Certainly the television industry has provided an outlet for exquisite productions. National Geographic specials and the various network specials are incredibly useful in the teaching process, and yet the procedures and strategies for supplying those kinds of rather expensive materials sometimes just aren't in the cards. We just can't cycle those things in the routine kinds of ways that we have cycled films in the past, and that applies to other kinds of media formats as well. But I think the audiovisual field is in a period of re-examination, of trying to see how we've examined our past a bit, and we're beginning to look toward the future and trying to reassess what our general future will be in relationship to the total process in education. We've speculated a little bit about the future, Elizabeth, and I know that this may be even an unfair question, but one that I'd like to pose. What do you perceive as being the future of our profession? And I use the profession education in its broadest sense first, but then perhaps be a little more specific and about the audiovisual field and profession. Where are we going? How do you see that?
Well, Cal, I think that how we go depends upon the individual situation where we are. I think where we are going must be, as I think I may have said before, that we are an integral part of what is going on in the schools. Some of us are held back in many places in this country by changing leadership that is not experienced in media fields. Some of us are pushed with leadership that has understanding and enthusiasm for it. I think that what videotaping does is becoming a very important part of what's going on in the schools. But basically, Cal, I think perhaps it's because I come from the decades that I do. There are so few things that, to me, compete or compare with the very real value of what films do, that it is hard for me to really feel that we will be without them. I wish that I knew.
Yeah, I'm sure that we all wish we knew. Finishing up, Elizabeth, you're certainly a busy and a vital person. As I understand it, you're very much involved in Jefferson County politics, history of Jefferson County, and in fact mentioned in our pre-recording discussions, the small town of Kimmswick is doing some reconstruction, and you're taking an interest in that. Certainly gardening, your hobby of birding, and simply enjoying your sort of retirement with Eleanor Hayward, your longtime friend. That must really be what keeps you young.
Well, Cal, I feel I'm blessed with good health. I think I feel the joy that comes with getting certain perspective when you get away from the busyness of day-by-day work. I think a great deal about people and about situations within the audiovisual field. Wish that those of you who are working with it all the time had more time to get away from it once in a while. But I think that many things that I've been interested in all my life feed into my present, because every day is a new experience. I love to see what the weather does, what is happening with the changes in growth, what's happening with the wildlife. We are fortunate to live back in the hills where we have wild turkey, where we have deer, and where we have neighbors that are different from the people that I've known all my life and are the salt of the earth. And I love knowing what's going on, but I'm glad to not be the active part of it that I was for many years.
Elizabeth, this has been a unique experience for me. I think that young people, and now in my case, not so young people, would have missed a great deal in not having known and learned to thoroughly enjoy the friendship and respect of a person such as yourself over time. And I do thank you for the opportunity of talking informally this morning. I would hope that you will continue to be the spokesman and mentor of the audiovisual field, and we certainly look forward to a continued relationship, both professionally and personally. Thank you again.